Donald Trump has made a claim about how unfair Canada is, using numbers so high, they're kind of hard to believe.
They're charging us over 200% for dairy products, 250%, 270% tariff.
And he's right. He's right. But Trump's claim is an attack on Canada's so-called supply management system. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to put you to sleep with all the boring details of how it works yet, but supply management in the context of dairy is just basically how Canada strictly controls production, prices, and foreign access to this country's dairy market in order to protect it. That last one, foreign access, is where Trump's 250, 270% tariff number comes in. Because indeed, skimming through this 1,400-page tariff schedule, we can see milk and cream, low fat. Canada charges a 241% tariff on imports. As the fat content goes up, so does the tariff rate, up to 292.5%.
Canada has been ripping us off for years.
Yogurt is where you'll find 250.5% tariffs, and whether you're talking about powdered buttermilk at 208% or butter itself at 298.5%, maybe these rates do seem kind of crazy, especially coming from a country like Canada that thinks a mere 25% tariff imposed on its goods is too much.
He's attacking Canadian families, workers, and businesses, and we cannot let him succeed.
But let's ask the question, how often does anybody actually pay these incredibly high tariff rates?
Almost never.
As is often the case, the Trump administration has taken a thread of truth and then applied it inaccurately across the whole system.
Understand about the high tariffs that Trump is talking about, 200, 300, even 400%.
Going up to 400%. You never hear that. Canada's absolutely one of the worst.
So that number just isn't true. None of these dairy tariffs goes up to 400. So in that case, Trump is literally just making numbers up. But the thing about these high tariffs is that they don't actually apply right away, or arguably ever. For the last 3 years running, the U.S. has exported more than $1 billion worth of dairy to Canada. In the entire world, only Mexico buys more dairy from the U.S. than Canadians do. And of the imports Canada tracks, not $1 of that amount saw any tariff at all.
Yes, the 241 or 250% quota exists, but it only exists for product that exceeds that tariff rate quota.
Translation? Let's say I want to buy all of your buckets of American milk, straight from the cow. My government puts tariffs on them, which would ordinarily make the milk more expensive. But they say, hey, Andrew, don't worry. You can buy the first 3 buckets tax-free. It's only at the moment you buy a 4th bucket. And let's call this whole thing the tariff rate quota. Once you exceed the quota, everything after 3 buckets, that's when you pay the crazy 300% tariff. Canada sets the limit on how much dairy anyone here can import into this country before they have to start paying 200, 300% extra. And until you reach that limit, American dairy faces 0 tariffs. But again, not only does nobody ever really buy so much American dairy that they hit the cap where you get slammed by that 300% markup, importers rarely even come close. This data was provided to us by Global Affairs Canada. Every year, they track how close importers got across various categories to having to pay the crazy high tariff markups. And on cheeses, yeah, that cap may very well be what prevents Canadian companies from buying more American product. But on nearly everything else, it's not necessarily the tariffs that stop Americans from selling to Canada. Otherwise, you would expect every bar on this graph to be closer to 100%.
No country has yet met the requirement to implement or to kick the tariffs into gear. So there is no tariff being applied to American dairy imports into Canada at this precise moment.
But let's go one level deeper, because what Trump is driving at, even if he misstates or gives misleading facts, is that there is something unfair about the way Canada treats U.S. dairy. And that is a belief the American government has often held going back long before Trump ever set foot in the Oval Office. Any honest assessment of the dairy trade between Canada and the US must ask the question, if US dairy farmers and processors and producers want to break into Canada's market so badly, why don't they fully use the selling room that they have? Like, why do they so rarely even come close to exceeding their tariff quota before complaining about it? Well, the group representing the American dairy industry puts it this way. Frustratingly, the US has never gotten close to exceeding our USMCA quotas because Canada has erected various protectionist measures that fly in the face of their blah, 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 blah. So here's where you have to stop thinking of this as Americans being unable to effectively sell their product to Canada, and more like why Canada doesn't always want to buy American, because it takes two parties to trade, right? A seller and a buyer. And one big issue seems to be that the Canadian businesses in a position to buy American dairy are often incentivized not to.
The quantities being imported from the US tend to be imported by Canadian processors, who in turn would rather use their own products than use the US products.
Yes, so this is where you do need to understand a bit around the specifics of what supply management actually is to understand why Donald Trump basically hates it.
Supply management controls how much milk is produced in Canada and how much the farmer gets paid. It also strictly limits imports.
Supply management in Canada is old, more than half a century old. It sets strict controls on how much milk farmers can produce based on how much Canadians are expected to consume. In exchange for accepting these controls, farmers are guaranteed a minimum price for all that milk they sell to the processors, who turn all of that milk into the actual dairy items that we see on store shelves. So the supply of milk is carefully managed, throttled, really, and farmers are promised a stable payday that doesn't fluctuate with random variables like weather or disease or market conditions.
There's a real connection, especially to dairy. We like to be self-sufficient in food, but especially dairy. We feed milk to our children. It's perishable. It doesn't travel well.
But the trade-off for consumers,
the result is higher prices than would exist in a more competitive market, or a market that allowed more imports to come from relatively low-cost producers, most importantly from the United States.
And in order to fully insulate these artificially higher prices from outside forces, the capstone of supply management is that the government does two things. It charges tariffs approaching and sometimes exceeding 300% on dairy imports, and it strategically decides who is allowed to sidestep those ultra-high rates.
The US processors would really like to be able to deal directly with retailers, directly with consumers, but the import quotas that are in place with zero tariff or near zero tariff are actually being held by Canadian processors for the most part, who have no interest in actually allowing US products into Canada.
And I can show this to you. On this Government of Canada website, I can see all of the companies who currently hold import quotas at 0% tariffs. You might recall yogurt and buttermilk. This was a category that had just 12% utilization last year, meaning of the 3.5 million kilograms of product that Canadian businesses were allowed to import from the US tariff-free, they only actually imported about 1/10 of that amount. And who are these businesses with access to zero tariff rates but not fully using them? Well, I can just click on the link here and we can see processors are a big part of that. Skodidakis Goat Farm, they're a multi-million-dollar company that makes Greek yogurt. Elite Dairy, they make all kinds of cheeses, sour creams, and yogurts. Saputo, scrolling down here, major player in the manufacture of dairy based in Quebec. And if you put yourself in the shoes of a Canadian company that benefits from higher, more stable supply-managed prices, the question is, how much incentive do you have to import from the US the same type of product that you already make in-house, but sometimes sell at a higher price?
The reason why we're not importing is that these import quotas are granted to companies that don't really see any incentive to import more competition.
So if I'm a cheese producer and I strictly produce cheddar, for example, well, I will not be tempted to import cheddar cheese from the US because that's already what I'm producing. So maybe I will only strictly be importing Swiss cheese or Monterey Jack, which would be complementing my current production, but it would not compete against my current production.
But then you have to ask, well, why does Canada grant import quotas to companies that don't seem interested in making full use of them? And this is where we get to the heart of the critique of Canadian supply management and whether it violates the principle of free trade.
The allegation is that the allocation of these licenses has been strategically manipulated in Canada to prevent U.S. exporters from using them. The Americans feel they're not getting access that they were promised under this agreement.
I don't want to suggest that this is the only reason so much zero tariff room goes unused. Canadian milk is held to a different standard than American milk. It has to be RBST free, for example, and that's a growth hormone. And businesses have to decide every day, would Canadians even want the American product if it were available?
And in some cases, it might just not be financially worthwhile to import. A sharp cheddar from Wisconsin may not be significantly better than some of the beautiful cheeses that we can make here in Canada, so there might just not be the demand for it.
But the extent to which Canada is or isn't gaming the system, this has been the subject of legal disputes, one of which forced Canada to make changes to how it manages dairy, but which the American dairy industry still says falls far short. Though the most recent legal ruling before a dispute settlement board ended up going very squarely in Canada's favor. So look, this half-century-old system is a bit like a ping-pong match, but consider how the back and forth might be, in a way, besides the point. American dairy represents a fraction of a percent of all Canada-US trade.
My strong belief is that President Trump is using the dairy sector strictly as an example. We have over $700 billion of trade between Canada and the US. Dairy represents 0.1% of all the trade that's being done. So whether or not they would have access to the Canadian market would not make any difference in the end.
In the scope of the trade relationship between Canada and the US, they're really small potatoes.
But dairy has huge sway in politics, and if Trump's plan is ultimately to put America first, Canadian dairy may just be the start.